and I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. Born and raised in Saskatoon, but with family in the Maritimes, family connections to the Maritimes, the foundation professor at George Mason University Scalia School of Law, F.H. Buckley. He is a frequent media guest and has appeared on Morning Joe, CNN, Rush Limbaugh, C-SPAN, was written for the Washington Journal, and appeared in the CBC and many others. He is a senior editor at the American Spectator, a columnist with the New York Post, and has written for the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, US News, National Review, amongst many others. His most recent books are The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America, The Once and Future King of American Illness. Would you please join me in welcoming Frank Buckley?
Thank you very much. Howdy. If you don't mind, I'll keep my hat on. Everybody needs a prop, and it's my homage to Leonard Cohen. Well, let me introduce myself a little bit more. I'm from out west originally. I went to school out east. And in '89, I moved from McGill and took a job in the States. I was doing law and economics, and nobody back there was interested in it, and University of Chicago was. So I moved around a bit. I went to Chicago, and I ended up at George Mason, which is in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from DC. And I became an American citizen only in 2014, right? Actually, I mean, if you're a Canadian, you sort of think, why bother, right? I mean, is there really a separate country here? But, so I became a citizen actually on tax day, and they said, welcome to America, here's the bill. And, that's fine. Nothing changed particularly. I was paying taxes before and paying afterwards. But around 15, 16 months back, I got interested in Donald Trump. I liked Trump a lot. I wrote stuff for Trump. And I had worked for about a dozen years on a program for federal judges. And very early on, it was suggested that Trump wanted to have a list of judges he would propose for the Supremes. And so I offered my list to somebody I know, Jeff Sessions, who's now the Attorney General. And I also suggested, well, when the list is released, here's a speech you could give. And somehow I ended up dealing with people in the campaign, notably the family and Steve Miller, and with a couple of other people, wrote first drafts of a whole bunch of speeches, and then advised on transition issues, which is basically where I am now. And so the question, I guess, here, roughly, it's a Sinclair Lewis question. It's, can it happen here, right? Can Trump be exported to Canada? And I think my answer will shock you, at least I hope it'll shock you. My answer is, and you won't believe it, it's already here. Trump's already here. How do I say that? Well, think about it, right? You've got an immigration system in Canada that Jeff Sessions absolutely loves. I mean, he has specifically singled out Canada as having a really, really great immigration system, and he's talking about the point system. And I tell him, it's way more complicated than just that, but in any event, that's a good start. You've got a tax system in Canada that Steve Moore would love, and more specifically, Mnuchin loves. So I think that's going to be great for America, and I think it'll be great for Canada as well. I think it'll be great to make America richer so they can buy more Canadian goods, so it'll be good for both countries. You've got a K-12 system here, which is absolutely superb, which Betsy DeVos would love. And you've got a rules of law system here, a civil justice system, which Nino Scalia would have loved. I mean, in the States, what we have is something like a demented slot machine of judicially sanctioned theft. So, the Canadian system really looks good by comparison. So, in other words, this is kind of like the promised land for a lot of Trump people. I mean, they don't know about it, of course, because it's Canada, right? But the fact is, it's there already, okay? And the interesting question, I guess, is, well, who do you praise or maybe blame for all of that? And my candidate, again, I think would surprise you, my candidate would be Sir John A. Macdonald. Now, Macdonald at the Charlottetown Conference came with a copy of Madison's notes of 1787, Philadelphia Convention under his arm, so he knew the debates about the American Constitution, and he said this is basically the most perfect work ever struck by the human hand, but we can do better. And what he did is he came up with what is something really unique? You know, you talk about the Westminster system, but it's really the Anglo-Canadian system, because what the Canadians did after years of free riding, by the way, was to find that a Westminster system which developed over centuries in one country with very different institutions, religion, geography than Canada, could nevertheless be exported. So it's more properly called the Anglo-Canadian system. And when it was adopted, Walter Bagehot said, this is great. Bagehot loved competition, so Bagehot said, now we have two models for countries emerging from colonialism. We have a revolutionary and a presidential model from the United States, and we have an étapiste and a parliamentary system that grew out of Canada and its experience with Confederation. And Bagehot thought, that's wonderful, we'll put them out and we'll see which one wins. And the answer is the Canadian model won, right? The Canadian model, or the Anglo-Canadian model, was adopted in 50 countries with a combined population of 2 billion people, and that is no small thing. And it is, moreover, superior as to the protection of liberty to those sad countries which have adopted the presidential system and given themselves presidents for life and the like. So, excuse me. So, McDonnell said we can do better, and what he had in mind were two things, two faults with the American system. One is gridlock, the fact that in a presidential system, you don't really have much of a reverse gear. You have to get all those three cherries in a row, right? President, Senate, House. And unless you do that, it becomes rather difficult to enact legislation, particularly when the country is so divided. And by contrast, in Canada, it's just one system. Now, Steve Bannon yesterday at CPAC talked about radical change in America. And of course, everybody gets their hackles up, but the point is, radical change is institutionalized in the Canadian Constitution. Governments will always do dumb things, but the great thing about a parliamentary system is you get to reverse them. You got to reverse gear. Whereas in the States, it turns into the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So you have this horrible 65 immigration law. You got a tax code last amended in '86. A perfect example of an inefficient tax code. You've got all these laws in the books you can't seem easily to get rid of, and that's a function of the separation of powers in the American system. And the other problem with the American system is power tends to centralize in the presidency, and you think it's bad with respect to prime ministers. Believe me, it's far worse in the United States. I mean, these are things that got conservatives going in the last couple of years, right? So if you want to understand Trump, think about all of the problems in the American Constitution, right? You have, firstly, the gridlock, things can't get done. You have a Tea Party revolution in 2010. You have a Tea Party revolution in 2014, and they go to DC and nothing happens thereafter, right? Whereas, you elect a government here, and hey, it can start legislating right away, certainly if it has a majority. So that, I think, is one reason why Canada has done better than the States in many respects. And maybe particularly with respect to what I think is, above all, the real cause for the Trump revolution. And this was the subject of my last book, and that is mobility. Now look, my teacher was Raymond Klebansky, and his teacher was Ferdinand Tönnies, and his mentor was Friedrich Engels, so that only 3 generations separate you from the Communist Manifesto. Marx had a problem with America. The problem was, according to his schema, the most advanced capitalist society would be the first to go communist or socialist. Well, the most advanced capitalist country in 1852 was the United States, and that wasn't about to happen. Marx had to come up with an explanation. Marx said, well, the answer is society is so fluid, there's so much movement intergenerationally, fathers and sons moving up and down the ranks, that there's no possibility of class consciousness. But what happens when the society becomes immobile? As it did, right? And what happens is Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So that was a huge explanation for what's going on. And it also, I think, tends to explain why part of the Trump revolution involves reinventing the Republican Party, turning it away from the perfect Republican idiots that inhabit National Review and the like, and making it more of a party that's open to ordinary working people of all classes, colors, races, all of that. And that's what the Republican Party is becoming. And that would, I mean, these policies that Trump has in mind are ones which will have the effect of making not only America great again, but America mobile again. And in that respect, more like Canada, because Canada is absolutely splendid when it comes to mobility. I mean, if you compare the two countries, in the middle between the 10th decile and the 90th, they're about the same, but the bottom 10th in the States pass on their poverty to their kids, and the top 10% pass on their privilege to the kids, and it really doesn't exist at all in Canada. So Canada is really like that country that one remembers from one's youth when everything is possible, kids go to college for the first time in their family, and when one doesn't see that sort of thing happening. What one does see is privilege being passed on. I'm in the DC area, I live in Alexandria, I teach in Arlington, and I sort of see how it works. I saw what I had to do to get my daughter into college. I mean, the competition starts, roughly in the second month of pregnancy. You're just, I mean, it doesn't work like that here. This is a much more egalitarian society, and therefore it's a society that's far less angry, right? We are far, Canada lacks that sense of frustration associated with gridlock. I mean, the idea of electing Tea Party Congresses that can't do anything, it just, that builds up after a while, and it finally expresses itself in a revolt against an establishment. Now, could something like this, I mean, are there messages then that one can take from this in Canada? I think there are, right? One message, for example, is do not put your faith in machinery. I was on CNN a couple of days before the election, and beside me is some, Democratic bigwig who said, "Oh, what about the ground game?" Right now, I had I guess we don't have one much, And look, a ground game is important, right? I remember buses in Brian Mulrooney's time from the old brewery Mission going to the polls. So yeah, sure. But, what Trump proved is it's not about the ground game. Neither is it about Mitt Romney's 59-point plan, right? It's about something more basic, about grabbing Americans and informing them that things are broken in very simple language, and Americans got that, right? So, I mean, some people, by the way, get worked up about, things Trump said. The funny thing is, the more outrageous stuff he said, the more popular he was. You know why? You heard the term virtue signaling, right? Because I think Prime Minister Trudeau is really good at it, okay? So, it's the ostentatious display of virtue. Some of you guys remember Beaver Cleaver? I mean, Leave It to Beaver. You remember Eddie Haskell? Why, that's a lovely dress you have on, Mrs. Cleaver, right? See, Eddie Haskell was a feminist, and he didn't care who knew it, right? So, the opposite of virtue signaling is Donald Trump, which was what? I mean, outrageousness signaling. And the more he did that, and without apologizing, the more people liked it. You know why? Because they thought, we need a guy like this to bust things up. And the more he does it and doesn't apologize, the more, we trust he's going to change things. Yeah, so, hey, I'm a sinner, he's a sinner. But last time around, we tried a later-day saint. You saw how that worked. So one message is, don't put your faith in the mechanics of it all. And don't put your faith in a 59-point plan like Mitt Romney did. But, there's something else. It's not 2015 anymore, it's 2017. And there's a time when people get tired, I should have thought, in government by selfie, right? I mean, there's a time when the adults should enter the room. And so, My advice, I guess, yeah, it's pretty cheap, you know, hey, I got here this morning and I'm a dual, okay, but I'm also an American, so there's a great American tradition. You get here for 3 hours and you tell, here's what you Canadians should do, right? Americans are good at this. And it doesn't take us long, right? 15 minutes, we can tell you everything. Well, I think it's time for a little bit of Johnny Get Angry, if I can also go back to an oldie song. Don't be polite. That's one of the messages from Trump. Don't be polite. Don't do Bob Stanfield. Don't do Mitt Romney. Do John Diefenbaker, like that. Be angry. And when you get, if you're an MP in the front bench, you know what you should, I think, be thinking? You should be channeling your Shakespeare. And you should be looking across at the other side and saying, oh, what a shame it is to me to know thy name or see thy face tomorrow. Okay. I don't like sitting because I was planning to body surf. Is that okay? Go ahead.
Does this work? Okay, great. Thank you for that. Thank you. And I know we've all heard the 15-minute American talk.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I want to touch on a few aspects of the Trump victory and a bit about how that relates, but also how it impacts on Canadian politics. And I think, to me, one of the big issues that's least understood by Canadians is why the immigration issue is such a big issue in the United States and how it differs from the way the system works here in Canada. Can you touch a little bit on how?
Yeah, totally. Works? You know how you got the Canadian? You know how the point system arose? I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, you go back. Can I stand? I mean, you go back to Deef's time, and who's the Minister of Immigration? Ellen Fairclough. And immigration actually declined in her time because she only wanted like her type of person. And then a premier came to Diefenbaker and said, you can't do that. It can't be based on Anglos. The premier was Maurice Duplessis. That's how you got the point system. Lovely little story, I thought. What's it like in the States? Well, in the States, never mind the way it was prior to 65. After 65, they adopted a system in which roughly the most recent arrivals would be privileged as to bringing in their relatives. So it's called it's family-based priority. And it exists in Canada, but Canada has only a relatively small chunk of family-based as compared to economic-based. Now, I should have thought it obvious that the point about immigration is admit the people who will make the Native Americans or Native Canadians better off, which is roughly the thinking behind the Canadian system. And by the way, when you do that, you can then afford to be generous with respect to a refugee policy. Look, I know there are a lot of problems with the Canadian refugee policy, fine, I heard it all, okay, but you know something? When you look at those videos from, 2 years ago, of Trudeau welcoming refugees, gee, it's hard to see that without being moved, Or there was this video of a recent arrival being taken out in a canoe and thinking to himself, what the hell am I doing here, right? Canoe, I mean, we didn't have canoes in Syria. So the sad thing about the present system is that the most generous country in the world's instinct to help other people is stifled when you can't trust your government anymore. Trust in government, in the feds, in the States is about 16%. I realize it's declining in Canada, right? And some people, libertarians, would say that's a good thing. I think it's a terrible thing. I mean, if you have trust in government, the idea is government is serving the people. So I think it's perfectly proper for a government to distinguish between its citizens and foreigners in terms of the intake under immigration, right? You shouldn't distinguish between Americans who are here, but you can certainly distinguish between Americans and non-Americans. That was, by the way, that was my problem with the Judge Curiel business. Remember the Mexican-American judge? I told people then that, he's an American, right? Not Mexican-American, he's an American. Not only that, but he was a native-born American, right? Which is more than Ted Cruz could say. So, you know, so the system was a total mess.
Just I don't want to leave that
Yeah.
point for a second. I think, does it not also play that one of the major differences how people immigrate into the country? So, you know, the southern border being the issue that it is, we just, you know, recently in Canada have seen asylum seekers come across our border
Right.
in very small numbers.
Yeah.
But the effect of the politics of having a system where in Canada Canadians pick and choose who comes into the country and who doesn't. In the U.S., is it fair to say that at this point, almost nobody does?
Well, we don't know what the situation in Canada is like with respect to illegals, right? I mean, the estimates vary from 500,000 to 300,000, so it's kind of an open number. It's vastly different in the States, and the point is there was no political will to change that. Why? Well, because everyone knows that there are political ramifications to your immigration decisions. Not only does everybody know this, but throughout American history, politics always dictated immigration policy. I mean, you go back to Jefferson and Adams' time. I mean, Adams is worried about revolutionary France and its immigrants, and Jefferson's worried about monarchists from England. There was only a brief period when Americans generally just liked immigrants, full stop, and that was roughly 1865 to 1900. Why? Because during that period, the immigrants split their votes, right? You had the Swedes and the Germans voting Republican, the Irish and the Italians voting Democratic, but you know, it kind of balanced out. But apart from that, now it's completely politicized, and what's behind it is a basic constituency of a Democratic Party is going to be the recent arrivals and the illegals as well. Nobody knows to the extent to which illegals might vote. I have no idea. I certainly shouldn't think it's 3 million, but it's something.
And on that, you know, the ability, there's been lots of debates about in the U.S. about immigration. There's also been, as a result, a lot of gridlock.
Yeah.
And isn't part of the Trump tied to the system of governments in that you have all that gridlock and the public see that nothing actually gets done in Washington?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Steve Miller asked me for about 4 constitutional conservative speeches, and I always wrote this speech in which Trump would say, I'm going to govern as a constitutional conservative and work with Congress. And the speech never got delivered, but here we are, and we've got a Republican Senate and a Republican House, and they're kind of coexisting pretty well at this point. So we expect that the system will work rather well because everybody's in the same party. Had it not been like that, and there was a point in which we thought the Senate would flip, at that point, I guess the question was, would Trump rule more by executive order as Obama did? And that was left open, but now we don't have to think about that. So I think he, in effect, is a constitutional conservative, just because he got lucky with all the 3 branches.
And then that would serve to why he would use the executive order so much, right? Because that would help to eliminate all the...
He was elected to do stuff, and the system under Obama was one in which, you remember what Obama said? If they don't do anything, I've got a pen and I've got a phone and I can do that. And this is, I think, ultimately the tendency of presidential politics is towards presidential rule, strong presidentialism. I mean, I've argued this point with a bunch of people in the States. George Will is one of them, and their argument is, no, here's what we do. Here's what we do. They're misbehaving. They're letting the president do everything, but we'll elect someday one of our own, right? And then if the other guys have Congress, our guy will rule moderately. He won't rule like a king, right? And that way we'll teach the Democrats a lesson, right? And I call that being a patsy, right? So, I mean, it's just cloud cuckoo land. So built into the system is an incentive towards executive power. The wonderful thing is Sir John A. figured it out way back when.
And on the issue of executive power and the use, I mean, one of the things I think a lot of Canadians are watching is on trade and how Canada is going to relate to the United States you touched on it in your speech, but does Canada matter to the Trump administration?
That's embarrassing. Does any other country matter much? It matters to some extent. I mean, this is a complicated question. I told Jared Kushner very early on, if you can't cut a trade deal with Canada, who can you do it with? There was never any sense that Canada was going to be given a rough time. Never, never, never. In other respects, changes in foreign policy will have an effect on the role of Canada generally in terms of world politics. Well, but let's not get into foreign policy. That's too big a question.
Yeah, but I do think I come from the Maritimes, and the Maritimes highly, our economy, particularly in the province of New Brunswick, resource-driven. I mean, our relationship with the United States is a big deal. In fact, even our small Atlantic premiers met in St. John's, Newfoundland, to talk about how they were going to deal with the Trump administration, which seems, given their size, difficult to believe they'll have any influence. But
I got to tell you, I've heard the words softwood lumber 1,000 times. I don't have a clue what that's about. You're permitted
unless you work at it,
you're
Frank.
permitted to be ignorant about a number of things. I picked that one.
I guess, though, it's the approach. So if Trudeau becomes the liberal opposition to Trump, or if he, there's been talk, right, in the American press about this. What impact would that have on us and the Trump administration?
You've heard, doubtless, the expression world famous in Toronto. Trudeau is world famous in Toronto. I mean, yes, the press at this point in the States is not to be believed. It's just quite extraordinary. I mean, I was on some talk show at one point talking about the Washington Post, and what I said is, it's extraordinary. The front page has always got about 2 anti-Trump stories. The Metro section has always got an anti-Trump story. The book reviews always has an anti-Trump story. The style section has an anti-Trump story, and one of the other guys said, yeah, and the food section too. Right? So, yeah, I mean, they will hold up other people, but it means nothing in terms of Americans, basically. I mean,
now just back to how Trump and the politics influence on Canada and whether or not it could happen here. I mean, part of the mobility we heard this morning with millennials and young peoples, even in Canada, we have a sizable problem with young people finding work in Canada. Does that not? Is there not similarities to draw between that and what's happened in the United States, where you have 33% of working people
it's
who are
far
unemployed?
worse in the States, and I'll tell you why. I mean, the Americans did something absolutely stupid, but self-interested, not stupid so much as self-interested. What they did is they have government-backed student loans, but unlike Canada, where the deal was, okay, the government will do this, but you, the universities, have to cap tuition. So in the States, they didn't cap tuition, right? And the universities took this as an excuse to take the money and run to the bank. So they raised tuition by an incredible amount of money, and it's not unusual for students to graduate with $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in student debt, right? And then what happens is they get to the job market and there aren't jobs, so they are debt slaves. And the answer is really actually fairly simple. At least I've argued that all you have to do is get back to the bankruptcy discharge. I don't know how it works. I've forgotten how it works in Canada, but in the States, you can't discharge your student loans. That was a change introduced in 1976. I think the proper thing to do in the States would be permit students to discharge their debt, and here's what is, I think, brilliant, and then leave the universities on the hook for it, which means the universities will bear the burden of the discharge, which means that the universities will know that people wanting a student loan for an engineering degree will pay it back, but people wanting a student loan for some rubbish degree will not pay it back because there'll never be a job. I mean, basically with these idiot degrees, you're signaling yourself to be unemployable forever. And those kinds of degrees will not be financed. You want to pay for it yourself, fine. But a crucial problem right now is how do we bust up the monasteries, right? I mean, Henry VIII did, but did it in a corrupt way. We have all these monasteries of privilege, notably in the academy, and the question is, how exactly do you take them on? And so that's one solution.
You know, in a few minutes, we're going to have the conservative leadership candidates.
Well, unless we run long.
Unless we run long, that's right. They got a clock
We
here.
could take a vote, you know. Okay.
Frank, they got a clock here. They give you orders.
Yeah.
If you were to meet with the 14, I think there's 14 candidates running. If you were to meet the 14, what particular advice and learnings do you think from Trump would you give to them, either during the leadership process and as well once one of them become leader?
Well, two things basically. I mean, number one, I said, Johnny, get angry, and the second is have a Twitter account. I mean, the level of frustration is far less in Canada than it was in the States, is in the States because of the gridlock problem. But, at a certain point, government by selfie begins to resemble little soap bubbles issued by a child, and they burst. And when they burst, you realize there was nothing to it. So signaling that you're the adult in the room, I think, would be the way to do it. Do not pay them the favor of taking them seriously. They don't deserve it.
I wonder, too, how much of that Trump bump that he got in the election was the fact that finally you had a politician who was, I mean, he was, whether you agree or not, he was actually saying what he wanted to, right? I mean, so often, and some of us who've worked in politics in the past know that, everything's so vetted and there's key messages and everything that happens. I mean, is part of the appeal not that it's so refreshing to see something so different?
Yeah, completely in the States, because politics in the States has been dominated by elite politicians, left and right. I mean, you had the perfect Republican idiots, doing their thing and cheered on by the Weekly Standard and so forth. One of the great moments in the campaign was in, I guess, the South Carolina primary, where Trump went out of his way to criticize the foreign policy of George Bush. And, God, we were waiting for that. We were waiting for that for so long. We knew it was stupid. I was actually in the White House when Bush left to sign the War Measures Resolution, or Powers Resolution. So I was kind of the fly on the wall, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. This is what would take America to war. So if you want to know why Bush thought we should go to war, like I was the fly on the wall, and he gave three reasons. I was going to say excuses. He said, firstly, they have weapons of mass destruction. Alternative facts. They have Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Alternative facts. And then there were a couple of us in the room, and one person said, yeah, but how's it going to pay for itself? And he said, well, this is the great thing. It'll pay for itself because we'll take all their oil. Madness. And the Republicans well deserved the trumping they got in 2006. So now we're over that. We're over the adventurism in foreign wars. We're over the idea that every country has freedom written in its heart. We don't want to do those things. We're not responsible for all of that. We'll look after America first. What else can you do? No honest man would ever want to do anything but prefer his own country. So finally, there's time for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you lay out that speech in South Carolina, because in the inauguration address, of course, one of the things, watching it, he launches into, as he launches into the speech, he, of course, thanks all the presidents for being there, and then actually almost goes through each and every one of their legacies and opposes it. Talks about how he's going to do it differently, right?
Yeah, no, I know. It was great. I mean, by the way, I was at the Canadian Embassy for that, which was sedate. Okay. The night before, I was at the Deplorable, which is a different sort of thing. But what I loved was, the series of bitch slaps, right? You wanted to go, yes, this is so great.
And how is that going to help him get this agenda? I mean, on the issue of gridlock, how is that going to help him with some of those power leaders in Washington to get some of this administration through? Or is this going to be an executive order president where he's doing what I think a lot of us on the right want to see happen is that somebody just do something.
You don't have
for
to
change,
cut a
right?
deal with Chuck Schumer, right? You don't have to cut a deal with Nancy Pelosi. You can treat them exactly the way they treated Republicans when they were in charge, right? And, so the deal making will be done with people like Ryan. And what will emerge, I don't know. I mean, there'll be an absolute revolution in foreign policy. It's interesting to speculate, by the way, what might happen with respect to Obamacare. Now, the mantra is repeal and replace, but it's hung up. All right, it's hung up, and it's hung up because we don't know what replace means. But we know that Trump said he thought every American should have health insurance. Now, think about that. Like, what does that mean? Well, I mean, one answer is something like the Canadian system with maybe some private insurance regime on top of that. Do you know why that would be brilliant? It would be the equivalent of Disraeli in 1867 dishing the Whigs with the Second Reform Act. It would utterly transform American politics. It is one of those cases where a general sees an enemy army just below him, and you're waiting to strike, and you know that it can happen, and you will destroy them, and you will win. Something like that is waiting to happen.
And what issue would you see that happening on?
Well, Obamacare, I mentioned. I mean, in the debates about what to do with Obamacare, which will go on for a while, yeah. But, in the short term, I don't know when that'll happen. In the short term, tax reform, not only is tax reform anticipated, but it's also been reflected in market prices. So, the stock market boom is totally a reaction to the assumption that we'll have a completely new tax regime. One where Steve Moore's advice has been taken very carefully. Regulatory reform will be interesting. And by the way, regulatory reform will involve, I suspect, something like the REINS Act, in which Congress gets to second-guess wasteful regulation. And that'll strengthen, the traditional view of America's Madisonian Constitution.
And I want to talk a bit, go back to the campaign a little bit. There's the point you mentioned in your presentation that I'm interested in. I used to work in electoral politics, but your assessment of the ground campaign, and this is, to me, one of the learnings here in Canada was, was there a ground campaign that no one knew about? And if there wasn't a ground campaign, does it actually say the ground campaign, the old style ground campaign where we spent money, time, and effort? Because I think one of the changes was, of course, the way the demographics worked, or who voted for him. But is the ground campaign alive or dead?
It's always alive, but its importance is, we have recognized that it is less important than we thought. I mean, I heard stories about the 5 different Hillary campaign shops in Florida, much good that did her, right? That wasn't what it was like. And in terms of, data-driven metrics, which is what everybody said 2012 was all about, the campaign got into that late in the day. It was something Rebecca Mercer was very interested in. And so they ended up with data on like 250 million Americans, which is, matches what the Dems did. But I don't think it was really that. It was other things. I mean, it was the blue firewall of the Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, so on. And one thing that was very important there, for example, which I was involved in, was Catholic outreach. So these are states that have a high degree of Catholic population. And, you're running against the government that gave you a lawsuit brought by the Little Sisters of the Poor. And let me tell you, when you are sued by the Little Sisters of the Poor, this is not good optics, right? So there is a sense that, which one should begin to feel in Canada, I think, there's a sense of the government opposed to ordinary Canadians, and ordinary Canadians tend to be believers. So you can get carried away with the smarmy, this is 2015 jargon, but the reality is that's not, I think, where most Canadians are. I don't happen to think that the government, any government, can do much to improve morals. So I'm not in favor of some grand moral rearmament scheme. My moral rearmament scheme for the government is get the heck out of the way and let people just do their thing. That's all you need.
So we have just about 3 minutes left, Frank. So I'm gonna, the Trump presidency is going to have a big effect on the conservative movement here in North America, I suspect around the world. Is this a return, is the Trump presidency about a return to the 1980s and in the demographic and political support? If you look at the states, for example.
You mean the Reagan Dems?
Is this a return to the old 1980s, or is this brand new?
I think this is brand new. I mean, the Reagan Dems were kind of a one-shot, right? I think this is more permanent. I think what you will see is a grand coalition that continues in time. At least that would be my hope. But as you mentioned, other countries, and as in the States, the word fascist is so easily bandied about, I'm reminded of something that Jean-François Revel said about American politics. He said, the dark night of fascism always seems to be descending in America, but somehow it lands in Europe. You know? Americans and Canadians don't do fascism. It's, you know, it's not who we are. So I wouldn't worry about that, but there was frustration, and there is a desire for constitutional change. And the people opposing constitutional change right now are all these people talking about how this was an illegitimate election, and you can resist it. These are the guys who, you know, well, I wouldn't call them fascists, but these are the non-democratic types.
Now, Frank, we have just 2 minutes. Is there anything you want to add or something I missed that you wanted to address while we're together?
Well, I guess there's one other thing. I mean, I think one of the great hidden issues was income immobility. I mean, for the first time, Americans said, we don't think our kids will have it as well off as we do. If that happens ever in Canada, you are ready for Trump. But the other thing was corruption. What a perfect candidate Hillary Clinton was, right? I mean, you know, she was just like a great balloon and you had this little pin, right? She was just waiting to be taken down as corrupt. She was easily, you know, apart from being incompetent, I mean, she was a very epitome of corruption in American public life. And we experienced in the election what might be called a Machiavellian moment. Machiavelli wrote about the rediscovery of classic Roman virtue, Republican virtue, and he proposed it for Florence in the 16th century. And Americans were said to have the same kind of Republican moment in 1776, opposing the corruption of Britain. And we had a Machiavellian moment in 2016 where the corrupt party was so easily identified in the person of Hillary Clinton. And Trump ran against corruption. I mean, he talked about it again and again. He talked about K Street. I mean, at this point, Congress is essentially, many people say, a farm team for K Street. You go to Congress, you know, you're earning, I forget, $170,000 a year, and then, you know, about 50% of congressmen after they leave Congress work as lobbyists, where they really cash in. So, you know, you become fabulously wealthy, roughly, if you run for Congress, but the payoff comes later. And Americans were just tired. They were tired of rules dictated by lobbyists, written into 1,000-page bills with 20,000 pages of regulations. They didn't think that's how you should do government.